Alrighty. Hello, everybody. This is another episode. Actually, this is part 2 of our new segment. This is Whose Battlefield Are We On? The first episode was with lovely Miss Colonel Towner Watkins, because ladies first. And now we have, this is Alex Krainer for part 2. And if people haven't read the description or you didn't catch the first episode, largely the title of Whose Battlefield Is This On is because we all the time are given our enemies, and that's across the board. Because when you have a movement, you need something to rally behind. And that was something that why we brought on Colonel Towner Watkins, was because as in the military always gives you your enemy, so you feel you are fighting for a proper cause. And so we had gotten her journey. What was it like? The enemy that they gave you, is it still the enemy that you find you're fighting now? And so this series is largely on how to change your axioms, because all of these people that, you know, our family listens to on a regular, they're very intelligent people. But what is the correlation between these intelligent people? They have to change their minds quite often, because that's the thing with digging and doing research, is that you don't always find things to support your bias. And so you have to remap on a regular basis. And so we've brought on Alex Krainer today because he also is an individual that we have watched. He's had to change his axioms going throughout his research. And so largely what we're going to do is we're going to see what was it like fighting the enemy that he was given earlier in his research, and then who he thinks the enemy is now. Because context for Albertans, with the independence movement, we are being given enemies to help rally the troops and support their independence movement. Yet this can also be brought into Canada as a whole, because Canada, to unite us, we've been told Trump and the US is our enemy. We have been told China is our enemy. And so really this series is to gather, who is it? Is it the people that they are giving us? And then the journey about how difficult it is to change axioms and change your mind once you gather new information. So, Dad, anything else to add?
No, I think you framed it nicely. Just want to tell Alex, thank you for coming and giving your time to us.
Yes.
And yeah, let's get into what you have to offer about the theme that's just been presented to you.
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, warm greetings to you and to all your viewers and listeners in Canada and beyond there. And I think that you ask a very important and very pertinent question, because we are deep in the fog of propaganda and psyops, and we are being persistently misled. And of course, the whole point is to give us the wrong idea about who the enemy is. And for any system to maintain social cohesion, it's important to have external enemies. That is, for the ruling establishment to be supported by a cohesive society, to have the population behind it, they're regularly given an external enemy that's systematically villainized, demonized, and this, we have been warned about this since the biblical times. I don't know, I couldn't recite all the quotes, but one of them is put on the whole armor of God, right? Ephesians
6.
Ephesians 6:18. We are warned that we will live in times when good will be called evil and evil will be called good. And I think we are in those times now. So exactly what's needed. This discussion is exactly what's needed. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to give my perspective on this. Basically, to understand things correctly, or to have a good foundation for understanding things, we have to start with the broadest possible context in which we live. And we have been told on many occasions that we are experiencing a conflict between two systems of governance. And we are being told this by actually the enemy, because the first time I heard this specifically from them was George Soros' speech in May 2021 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And the exact quote was, "The world is increasingly engaged in a struggle between two systems of governance." And then Soros goes on to say that is the conflict between open societies and closed societies. And basically, the idea is that the open societies are liberal democracies of the West, and the closed societies are authoritarian dictatorship, like Russia and China and Iran and so forth. And then you have other officials that will characterize it as a conflict between democracies and dictatorships, stuff like that, basically. And actually, this is not completely wrong, except that then they layer on top of it a whole bunch of lies. And also, if you go into how open societies got called open societies and the whole philosophy behind that, you realize that this is actually the enemy. And that comes from, I think, George Soros's mentor at Oxford, I think, was something like Karl Popper.
Karl Popper, yeah.
And then if you go into Karl Popper's philosophy, which Soros wholeheartedly embraced, you understand what you're talking about. And then the word open in that is, in my mind, the way it reads is, it's like Troy and the Trojan horse. The open societies are those who let the Trojan horse in, and the closed societies are those that don't let the Trojan horse in. And so we are open societies, and the Trojan horse is basically penetration by these enemy structures, actually. And they're enemies of us, of humanity in general. And then on the other side, you have societies that have shut the gates to the Trojan horse of the West, and they wish to be left alone. They wish to organize their societies as they see fit. They wish to use the resource, wealth, and labor, and creativity and talents and know-how in their societies for the benefit of their people. And we can't have that. Their resources are our resources. And if you don't open the gates of Troy, then we're going to open it by force. But, because ordinary people like us far-right extremists on this call, we don't stand for that. And so they have to demonize these enemies. So we always, when they wanted to take down Afghanistan, we heard a whole lot about how evil the Taliban are. And then when they wanted to take down Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq, we heard a whole lot about how evil he was. And then same thing with Libya, Serbia, Syria, Iran at the moment, Hugo Chavez, Nicolas Maduro, and it goes on and on and on. So the actual conflicts are always preceded by months of demonization. And that includes China, and that includes Islam in general. And the reality is that the enemy is at home, okay? Because it wasn't Saddam, it wasn't China, it wasn't Iran who brought us wonderful things like the COVID shots, wonderful things like CBDCs, medical assistance in dying, all of these. And I mean, the list is really long. And all of these abominations come from within our own system, from within our own open societies. And so it's very true that enemy is at home. But the enemy has to defend themselves, and what they do is they always distract you, and they always try to direct your grievances to some external enemy. And so one of the first things that they do is they take control of the media. And when they take the control of the media, they try to dominate the narrative. And so you will be hearing like the Chinese this and the Chinese that, and the Iranians this and the Iranians that, and so on, and on goes forever. Or if they don't, if it's not that, then it's, you know, the Iranians who are a horrible medieval oppressive regime that forces their women to wear burqas and doesn't allow them to go to school and educate themselves. And but those are distractions. The reality is this other one, that the enemy is at home, and they are working very hard on creating a total control matrix over us. And at one point, they plan to slam the gates of the prison yard shut, and then we're cooked. Well, that's their idea, of course.
How did you break out of that control grid? Because, so you alluded to in the beginning the broadest scope possible. So for you, starting to, who was the enemy in the beginning, and then why did that start shifting? Was it because you had to take your head out of the local game and start looking at other countries? Is that when things started to broaden? When did the control grid stop guiding your brain's narrative?
Yeah, because you've had several interviews, and hopefully people will go and check them out and follow you, where you found yourself kind of looking at the city of London as this system. There's this structure, and it has tentacles. Did you
Yeah.
always think that that was the case, or did your mind get brought somewhere? Because one of the reasons why we wanted to have your thought process to share with our audience is we've had to do that. We've had to change our axioms, how we thought we saw the world back in 2020, and then there was this evolution for my family, and a lot of personal accountability along the way, and some really really difficult nights, like sleepless nights, where you're finding yourself going, wow, you know, you made reference to the shots, and you made reference to geopolitical, where there's market manipulating tools. And so we find ourselves kind of going, holy smokes, there's a lot here, and it wasn't what I thought. I didn't know where I was on the map. Did you have a moment like that in your story?
I had a succession of moments like that. So first, when I grew up in the communist world, and so back then it was well, we referred to our society as a socialist society, but we were uh, under a one-party rule by the Communist Party. And so the official ideology was Marxism, basically, and we were taught Marxism in school and all these nice things. But you know, kids always question things, and we questioned Marxism, and we didn't just read our textbooks and listen to our lectures and go like, oh yeah, yes sir, that's how things are. We were like, well, what about this and what about that? And I remember when I was 16, we had these extensive debates with our Marxism professor in high school, and I guarantee you, she didn't convince anybody. I mean, nobody was buying it, you know. But you know what is the actual truth? That's a different story. You know, you just see that shit doesn't work the way they tell us that it should. So there's something else going on. Well, what is it? And so it was capitalism versus socialism in the beginning, or communism. And then in 1991, we had a war in former Yugoslavia, and I happened to have, you know, I volunteered for the military service. I served partly during the war, and I was convinced enough that I volunteered. I wasn't drafted. I volunteered to go into the military service, and probably like many, let's say, Ukrainians today, I thought I was fighting for the freedom of my country. You know,
Mm-hmm.
okay, it took me a whole long time to realize that I wasn't fighting for freedom of my country, that I was just fighting for one side, and that the freedom that we won was being ruled over by Belgrade from Serbia to being ruled over by Brussels, under European Union. And I would say that Brussels is a whole lot worse, like a whole lot worse. Anyway, so that kind of gets you thinking. And then a big one was 9/11, because I think about 2 weeks after 9/11 happened, I stumbled upon the Project for the New American Century website. And then I read it, and I was like, holy shit, okay, so that wasn't what we thought it was. And I have to add another thing, is that for a very, very long time, and that probably goes back to my teenage years, I didn't understand what money was. We had these little pieces of paper, and everybody worked for them.
Right.
And I could go get my hair cut and give them these little pieces of paper for that. And then I could go to the grocery store, and they would give me food for these little pieces of paper. But I didn't know what these little pieces of paper represented. And so later on, I studied economics, and I was very curious about money. What is money, and where does it come from? And then we had, chapters, or I remember I was in the United States, in California, a place called Moorpark College, and I had a professor. His name was Mr. Gucciardo. And so I remember the lesson about money, and so he would give us the whole lecture was about money, and then he explained how money came into being and what it represents, and then he said, "Is that clear? Is that clear?" And I was the geek in the front row, and I was like, "It's not clear. I don't understand." and then he repeated the whole explanation again, a bit condensed, and he says, "Is it clear now?" I was like, no, it's not.
That's funny.
And then he gave another condensed version of the exact same explanation that didn't work. And he's like, "Do you understand now?" And I could feel
The classmates.
other students giving me the
their
evil
eyes burning into the back of your head. Yeah.
And so I was like, "Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense." So I have no idea.
Aww. Damn.
And so that has been always a puzzle. So I try to understand this. So I always kind of paid attention to that issue, which is actually central to all of this. But it was one of the things that kept me, thinking and reading and researching and trying to explain it to myself. And then what came after 9/11? Yeah, after 9/11, we had months or years of propaganda bombardment about Islam. And so the biggest problem for humanity was Islam, and Islamofascism became a word, and clash of civilizations, and on and on and on. And then I thought, well, if they're bending over backwards so far to convince us that Islam is so evil, then I'm starting to get a little bit suspicious. So I started reading up on Islam, and well, lo and behold, there's barely any truth in what they try to convince us of. And of course the pandemic, I was 100% convinced from day zero, from before we even had lockdowns. I was 100% convinced that it was a hoax, because I've been paying attention to this since 9/11, basically. You had the anthrax scare, but then after that you had, I think starting in 2003, you had SARS and MERS, and H1N1 and H1N5 or whatever it was, and the Zika virus,
Bird
and
flu,
the Spanish, and the bird flu, and the Mexican swine flu. And it was just like once every year or 2 years, we had like a big hysteria about some new virus, and then suddenly the story would die and everybody would move on. But I would try to read up on like what the hell happened, and then I discovered it's every single time it was a hoax, especially the 2009 swine flu virus. And with the swine flu virus, they went and distributed a vaccine against it. And then there was a case in Scandinavia and in Great Britain that they had like 800 or 900 cases of narcolepsy. And it was all like, oh, no, no, that's like a rare genetic blah, blah, this and that, nothing to do with the vaccines. They're safe and effective and so forth. And then many years later, I don't know, maybe 10 years later, the Karolinska Institute from Stockholm actually deconstructed the exact mechanism that compounds in the virus actually destroyed people's, I don't know which gland exactly, which regulates the sleep cycle. So that's how people got, there's no question about it now. But like they all, instead of that being a complete disaster and some heads rolling, they just kind of shove it under the carpet. They try to intimidate people who talk about it into silence, and they move on and they continue to insist the vaccines are safe and effective. Well, that's not coming from the Russians or from the Chinese or from the Iranians or from the Saddam Hussein or anybody. That's like
Right.
some kind of a system that's at home.
Right.
And it's really a system because it's not, you can slam Anthony Fauci into prison, you can put Bill Gates into prison, but the system's not going to change.
Although that would be a good start. But yeah, I'm picking up what you're laying down.
Yeah. And so it was all of this together. And the question of vaccines in general, because I remember very well at some point in 2007 or in 2008, like I had some friends that I was very close with, and they were very well educated, wealthy, reasonable, normal, healthy, devout Americans. And they had many children. And we sat around dinner table one day and they said like, oh, we didn't vaccinate any of our kids against anything. I was like, a baking powder? Like what? And they said, yeah, because, and then they gave me, what you could share across the dinner table. And I was, if it was somebody else, maybe I would say like, okay, you guys are a bit loopy for me. But since it was
Fringe.
coming from, yeah, exactly. So then I started looking into it and holy crap, they were right. And so are we allowed to say that on this podcast? I became like a card carrying anti-vaxxer a very short time after that. And I'm not even saying vaccine hesitant. I'm saying like far right anti-vaxxer. Yeah. So it's been like that, and then you always have to ask yourself, well, who's behind this? Who's pushing this? And you realize it's not like some evil person is pushing this and then you will eliminate them and then everybody's going to live happily ever after. The whole system is built like this. And then we do also have those biblical warnings that you're not fighting against men, you're fighting against a system. That's your enemy. And the trouble with that is that if you fight a system, then you're fighting the exact matrix in which you live. Meaning, like, you have to tear down the house in which you live and build a new one. So I also started thinking about what the different system should be, what it should look like, how it should be constructed and conceptualized. And it's an ongoing process because I hate to admit it, but I don't have all the answers.
Neither do we. I mean, as you can see, even in our logo in the background behind the fireplace, the hearth is the brain. And our family has done a lot of work with Ian McGilchrist's work and other literatures, that because the enemy that lays within is also what creates these systems. So, a lot of the times we're all too often satisfied with maybe going ethereal. But when you go ethereal for outside of yourself, then you're more susceptible to influences coming into your zeitgeist that will push you in a particular direction. And then key bono has to be asked, right? When all of a sudden you find yourself with emotional response, you're looking at where it is that they're trying to direct you. And it's like, okay, so, the three questions I find myself asking, especially since 2020, is, well, what happens if I physically think and demonstrate in the manner that they're asking me to think and demonstrate myself? Who benefits if I do think that way and then demonstrate myself that way? And then if they benefit, what does it propose? Like, how does this contribute to this system that they've built up around us? And that's one of the reasons why we found ourselves looking like in Alberta. We're involved in the independence movement, and Colonel Towner had mentioned something that constructing countries. The British Empire has done this, like Sykes-Picot, like drawing lines in places. So making countries when they want to make countries, no problem.
Yeah.
In fact, you don't even need the people's permission. So here we are on the ground, actually having to like do the hard work, get the signatures for a referendum. And while this is all going on, there's like the next wave of the COVID hysteria, right? Separatists. This is the new separatists and traitors, and we find ourselves, you can see this in the media, and right away it's like that's the divide to conquer strategy playing out again.
But you guys are traitors to who? To what?
Right.
They think we're traitors to Canada.
Oh, to Canada. You mean the country whose prime minister elected by people swears allegiance and loyalty to the king in England?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah,
the one that gets selected ahead of time at the Bilderberg meetings.
Oh, okay then. Well, okay. Look, with regards to Ian McGilchrist, the book you had on the screen, Master and His Emissary, I think that's one of the most important books I've ever read. And if you guys read it, I commend you, because that book is a lot of work.
Oh
yeah, I did.
Yeah, we did a whole book study on it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you could go back on our channel and we did a book study on it.
Yeah.
I'm one of those geeks.
I did a 3-hour presentation on Rising Tide Foundation.
Yeah, that is brilliant, and it's a massively important contribution in our understandings of ourselves, because I think that ultimately we need that, because we have lived in this matrix for generations now. In one of my articles, I've written about that problem, and I kind of used the analogy of chickens living in a feedlot for generations. They don't have a concept of what life outside of the feedlot should be. And they, what chickens in the feedlot look like basically like shit, right? And the environment in which they live, they that's their normal, and that's the life that they have to cope with. But outside of that feedlot, what's it like there? We don't know. We've never experienced it. Not only that, we've never experienced ourselves outside of that feedlot. So we don't even know properly who we are and what we would be like. And I've noticed that the owners of the matrix keep trying to persuade us that we're horrible. We keep hearing about human nature. Oh, it's, like terrible. So, the implication is that we always need some authority guarding over us to save us from ourselves. That has now become so deeply ingrained in many people's mindset that I very often, I live here in Monaco. There's a lot of British people here. And I've had many arguments with the British people, about the Russians, about the Chinese, about Islam, about all kinds of everything, and I can explain where I stand. And what I've noticed is that every time, like rather than admitting that, something ain't right about all this, they will just default to, oh, it's everything's shit. We're all shit. Like the other side, we are shit, but the other side is also shit. And so it's awful. It all boils down to us being horrible. And also that it's very necessary for us to be, like it's the Hobbesian thing of like life outside of the matrix would be short, violent, and brutish, something, like not the exact quote, but basically that's the idea. And so we have to absolutely accept the state authority to rule over us and to limit our freedoms, always for our health and safety, always for no other reason than our health and safety. But then if you read like a little bit of free range anthropology, let's call it that, so anthropology outside of these academic institutions that have to give the seal of approval to everything, and if it isn't published in the Journal of Anthropology, it's all fringe lunacy.
UNESCO.
And you find out that human beings are actually wonderful. That wherever you go, if you go to native tribes, that they are almost invariably extremely friendly, welcoming, that they are always very happy. Like many travelers describe these tribes as very, very happy people, all-time feast and constant laughter, something to that effect. And it makes sense, because why should we be the only effing species on Earth that has to work for a living? No other species does. And we are orders of magnitude more productive than any other species. So shouldn't we be like extraordinarily affluent? Shouldn't we live in stunningly beautiful cities with cathedrals everywhere, with palatial homes, with fountains and swimming pools and horses and petting zoos? But you know what I mean. And instead, for some reason, we work our asses off in these hyper-productive economic systems, and we can barely make ends meet. How the hell did that happen?
That sounds to me like the system's working exactly how it was designed.
It is working exactly as designed. Exactly. You're exactly right. But the takeaway of what I'm trying to say is that we shouldn't be afraid of ourselves, and we shouldn't be afraid of breaking out of that matrix. And the last, I can't explain this, but I'll just give you a little tidbit that I just came across maybe a week or two ago, where somebody made a post about a guy who went on a pilgrimage in Spain. You know, those pilgrimages where people walk forever and then they get to, I think, I forget where. I'm a Catholic, just not a very good one.
Aren't we all?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was raised Roman Irish Catholic, so I get it.
Yeah. Well, this guy got kind of stuck on that pilgrimage, and he's been doing it for, like, I think, if I remember correctly, something stunning like 9 years or 12 years. I forget, but many, many years. And so this person who bumped into this man on the path, he was like, but what's the most important thing you learned on this pilgrimage? And the guy says, like, well, the most surprising thing I learned is that I don't need money at all in my life. So he hasn't been making any money, and he hasn't been needing any money. He just lives. And somehow, magically, he's fine, and he's not emaciated. This actually looks quite prosperous in that sense. And I thought, interesting, isn't it? and we're all stressing about, money and paying bills and all that. Okay, I of course I do the same. Don't get me wrong. I'm not a rebel in this sense.
Well, you're also, I mean, you're still a family man, and it's
Yeah,
in,
yeah, exactly.
we're in a world today where, go to your point, people are very giving, and even in Alberta, a lot of the sentiments you've expressed, their reason for wanting independence is that very thing. They're looking around at one another and their children, and they're going, "Isn't there more? I thought there was more." And they're
Yeah.
right. And so that the whole endeavor is to work hard to get there, because most, good things in life do take effort, and they're willing. And that's why we are where we are, because they want to be able to see what is that potential. They believe that they know and done the research into the system. The taxes don't need to be as high as they are. And then some of the agendas prohibiting infrastructure building, they don't need to be there. And so it really is just they want to capitalize on the human potential to invest in one another and be able to increase their capacity for growth. It is not a reduction of growth.
I was having a conversation, like me and Maddie had an interview with, again, I keep mentioning it, and I never thought that I would keep referring to this interview, but we had one with Mega Lillywhite, and what she was talking about is basically if you had to try and describe the sort of like hemispheres from a non-hemispheric metaphor, how would you do it? And she did a great job, and she was referring to it as kind of like civilizational based thinking. And I was bringing forward the sort of economic sort of philosophy that you can use, as in like if people can barely make ends meet, right? If they don't have the money, and so they're constantly having to slave away and work, as you're alluding to try and at least feed their families and put food on the table, right? I was saying it doesn't necessarily give enough free space for them to have time to think about beauty, or have like to take the moment to pause and look at the beautiful like tree that's outside or the leaf on the ground and admire all the intricacies. It's like, and then she said that, well, I mean, it's not necessarily just boiled down to material wealth, right? Because when it comes to, as we know, the oligarchs, and as you've been studying with like a lot of the financialists, that they can be the most like affluent people on the planet and the most selfish, self-centered, like loathing people on the planet, and yet you can also have individuals who are not particularly wealthy and well off, and they're the kindest people that you probably are going to meet, and they'd still probably give you the t-shirt off their back knowing damn well they can't actually afford another one. But I think that was a good kind of ethos to look at it from the perspective of, as you were saying, we don't really know ourselves and what it is that we could be if we're in this sort of like chicken coop thing. And so it's one of those, well, then it means that there's something about us that needs to be uplifted well beyond just thinking about like monetary wealth, and actually like morally. And that's where, when I was reading the hemisphere work and I was looking at the right and the left hemisphere and such, like reading that, for me it was one of those, okay, like why aren't we living in a sort of, you kind of painted it utopic, but like in our own paradise? And like, as Maddie was saying, why can't we have more? Like, if we are so advanced as a species, we're very productive, we know how to problem solve, we know what to think, why aren't we in that state? And I felt like reading that work, it answered the question that there's an oligarch within each and every person. There's the ability for us to be self-centered, for us to, as you were alluding to your friends that you were having debates with, right? They're not really listening, they're glazing over, they're kind of going like, oh, well, you know what, I don't want to put in the work to understand anything of what you said, so all I can do is go for the most general interpretation, not even generous, just general interpretation, which is, oh, well, we're all just terrible, and human beings just deserve what it is that we have coming to us, instead of actually realizing that it just takes work and long-term thinking in order to see that we could be something more than just this short-term system that we've been branded to think that we are. And I think that when I learned that like we are very capable of doing these things, it was funny, because one of the examples that always made me laugh was, there was like a woman who had like a right hemispheric deficiency, and then the
So
doctor.
when you talk about left and right hemisphere, you're referring to the hemispheres of the brain, right?
Yes, hemispheres of the brain. Yeah,
We're back in school.
yeah. And there was a doctor that was sitting down with the patient who was having a right hemisphere frontal lobe dysfunction. And I forget what the specific illness was, but they couldn't recognize the left side of their body because of the fact that their right hemisphere was dysfunctioning and such. And so basically the doctor's like, whose arm is this? And he's holding up this patient's arm. And the patient's like, it's your arm. And he's like, it's my arm. The doctor, like, it's your arm, doctor. It's like, no. He's like, what if I told you, how would you feel if I told you that it was your arm? And then simply the patient just says, I wouldn't believe you, right? And then once the sort of like magnetic stimulus comes back online for these patients, similar stories, they recognize, of course it's my arm. What are you talking about? Like, and so I'm like, it's crazy because even just tiny examples like that, people, it still kind of goes over their head. And I'm like, but that's you. Like you literally have a part of your self that is going to go into states of denial. It will resort to anger first, and it would rather say that it's anything but what it actually physically is in reality. And I'm like, that's how you get oligarchs. That's why we don't have utopias necessarily, or what you're talking about, is because we are our own hindrance. I'm saying that not as in like all human beings suck. I'm not placating to that. I'm placating to, we are the only, like, it should be comforting to know that you're responsible for yourself, and you're responsible for the environment that surrounds you, because it means you can do something about it. And I think that was something that exposed me to that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But this, this building up the left side of the brain and neglecting the right side of the brain is being done to us within this matrix deliberately.
Yep.
I've noticed. I had kids, and I remember that when they were born.
I have that ringtone too. Sorry, side note. I heard you on like a Crypto Rich episode, and then I heard it in the background. Yeah. And I literally paused, like, I have the same ringtone as Alex Krainer. Okay, sorry, go on.
Yeah. So when they were born and when they were very, very little, they were very telepathic. Okay, I'll tell you this story because it's very fascinating. So this was at some point, I think, in 2015, 2016. And I remember that in 2008 or 9, I read this book called The Hierarchy. Okay. And The Hierarchy was like written by some, how do you call them? Freemasons. And it's not a very remarkable book, but one thing that I remembered was that they had an alternative theory about where the name of America came from. Okay. And the explanation was that at the time when the Americas were being discovered, that the seamen who were going across the Atlantic to the new land that didn't have a name yet were referring to a star called America with an M, right? So I thought that was interesting. And so sailing across the ocean was sailing towards La America, right? La America, because these were, Italians, Spaniards, and so forth. So I thought, well, that's very interesting, And then at this point, I thought, like, oh, I'm sure that if there's something to that, the internet would have dug up a whole lot of stuff. So I made a search on it. I made a search on it online to see if there's a discussion about this, if there's actual evidence and indications that this is really the case. I didn't find anything. The only references was to this same exact book. So basically, there's one source. But anyway, I spent an evening kind of thinking about this and doing a little bit of research online about it. Nothing came out. I shut it down. I closed the computer, And then the next day, the very next day, I'm picking up my kids who are living with with their mother. So when I was doing this, they were with their mother. The next day, I'm picking them up, and we're driving over to Croatia. Right? That's what happened. And so I pick them up. I get them in the car. My younger boy was 7 years old at the time. And so we're driving across, which is about 8 hours drive. And about 2.5 hours into that drive, Jesse goes, "Dad, what's America without an A?" And I'm like, "What do you mean, Jesse? Do you mean what is America?" He said, "Yes. What is that?" And I said, "I have no idea. But why do you ask?" And he's like, "Well, I don't know, just like that." He didn't know what he was asking, but he wanted to know what America it was. And I didn't mention that. I didn't say anything to them. He wasn't in my house when I was, thinking about this, right? And he's 7. So we're not talking about what are you doing, what are you researching these days. But clearly, and like that's a very random word to pick up. He didn't hear it from his mom. He didn't hear it from anybody because nobody says America for any reason, right? So that was one of the 20 plus examples. And that, to my mind, has got to come from the right brain. And how that happens, I don't know, but it clearly happens. And I've noticed that these episodes, when they start going to school, it atrophies.
Yeah.
Because now you're priming up your left brain.
Yeah.
So that's who we are. And who knows, maybe if we lived outside of this violent matrix, because it is violent, it forces us to not be ourselves, right? Maybe this telepathy would be the most ordinary way for us to communicate with one another. Maybe we would, and this, many travelers among native tribes have recorded many, many, many instances of this, where they, I don't know, I saw a documentary where the Bushmen go on a hunt for a giraffe. And after 4 days of chasing after a giraffe, they kill it. And they have like a British guy there who's filming and making a documentary out of it. And then the British guy says like, "Hey, like, are you going to send somebody to your village to tell them that you're coming back with meat?" And they're like, "What are you talking about? They know." And he's like, "Well, how would they know?" And these Bushmen are like, "What's wrong with you? Of course they know." Like to them, it's like, of course they know, because they know how. Well, they do. But that's been stomped out of our psyche. So we not only not recognize it, not only do we not use it, not only do we not practice and cultivate those, let's call it, capabilities. If you mention them, you get ridiculed. They're like, you're a woo-woo. There's no evidence. There's no evidence. There's no peer-reviewed paper that confirms what you're saying.
Not entirely true about the no peer-reviewed evidence as far as that goes. Gilchrist continued his work with A Matter of Things, Volume 1 and 2, which I'm working on.
Yeah, and there's also Rupert. Yeah, when I say no evidence, I'm just saying, that's like the default response. And there's also Rupert Sheldrake, with his many, many scientific experiments. Like, I think he published a book called "The Dogs Who Know When Their Owners Come Back," or something like that. It's a title like that, but it's entirely serious. And then, parrots that learn how to speak, and the horse that learns how to spell. I don't know if that's in Rupert Sheldrake, but there was a horse that learned how to spell. Did you guys know the story?
Haven't heard that one. Nope.
No.
Beautiful Jim. The horse's name was Beautiful Jim. Jim. And the horse was adopted by a former slave like 100 years ago or so. And this guy kind of fell in love with the horse. They tried, it was like an entrepreneurial thing. They tried to breed a racehorse because they thought they would be winning races. And so this male horse came out, and as soon as it was born, they realized that he wasn't going to amount to much. He's not going to win any races. And then the guy says, but I looked into his eyes and I saw something, and I decided to keep him. And so this guy, who was a former slave, he kept the horse. But not only did he keep the horse, he like lived with the horse, like he would sleep in the barn with that horse. And so they were extremely close. And the horse ended up knowing how to spell words. Basically, what they would do is they would put like a shelf with letters on it, right? And then he would tell him a word. And then the horse would go and with his lips pick up these letters, which were like printed on
almost like a cue card. Yeah, tiles. Okay.
Yeah. And the horse would basically put the word together. And I watched a video about this story on YouTube at some point, I think. I thought it was bullshit. But then I went and looked at it, and it's true. This horse was going around the country in the United States, and they were selling tickets for this. And it became like a whole big spectacle that everybody knew in the United States at that time. It was in the newspapers. They would advertise, oh, the beautiful Jim is coming to town. And I forget who the president was at the time, maybe Woodrow Wilson or somebody like that. And then in one article, it said that Woodrow Wilson's daughter, or whoever the president was, James Garfield's, that the president's daughter was going to that, and nobody, there's no dispute that the horse could spell. There was a horse. How did that happen? I think that the way that happened is, first of all, the horse didn't go to school, right? Second, he was very close with his owner. So this owner was like a parent to him. They were very close. And they spent a lot of time together. And another thing that I noticed is that when my kids were little, they really, really, really wanted to sleep with me, like in the same bed. So they would always beg me to stay and sleep in my bed. And, like at first I was like, no way. You have your little, you spent a lot of money on the children's room. The more you sleep in it, the cheaper it gets per night. But then, I thought about it, and I thought, well, if they're asking for this, maybe there's a reason, maybe there's something inside them that maybe they need this. So at some point I said, like, all right, fine. So we put two beds together, and for a few years they slept right next to me. And then magically at some point when they were 12, 13, now suddenly they have a different need. They need their own space, and they say, like, no, Dad, I'm going to go to my bed. And and that felt kind of natural. Anyway, those are little maybe glimpses of life outside the matrix, but I think the very encouraging aspects to them is that they indicate that the hardwiring is still there. So we didn't, the human nature didn't change. It just got stunted a little bit, but we still have it.
And there's a direct correlation to the timing of the behavior that you're mentioning for your kids too. We've had conversations with other individuals that were explaining certain time periods where their children were like highly intuitive. Their intuition from the right hemisphere, very similar to even like how you'd think about dolphins communicating using sound waves, the ability almost by osmosis. Like we use terminologies as best we can to describe a natural instinct that's always available to the right hemisphere. And as a child's mind's developing, there is this neat correlation where you get the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere second to last to finish, because then the right hemisphere does the final push, and we literally have an education system that's designed to hijack our young people right in the framework when the left hemisphere is at a very dominant place within the person's development, and the right hemisphere is trying to finish up. So you end up with a sort of like that. You have high empathy and high intuition for the world, and sort of like the I want to save the world syndrome, especially with girls, and this happens right in the university time frame, because your frontal lobe in the right hemisphere for a well-balanced brain, at least a human brain, finishes up right around the age of 25, 26, and that's right when you should be finishing your indoctrination from our education system. So they've hijacked your right hemisphere from finishing its development where it would be the most beneficial for community, society, family, and instead they have it indoctrinated with the more dogmatic power, control, manipulation, because that's the mode of being of the left hemisphere. And it's quite confident that it's right about all things, even though it's being confident about that which it cannot understand.
Yes, I would say they're beyond confident. They're hubristic and arrogant.
Yeah, that's a signature.
They dismiss everything that falls outside of that framework. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rupert Sheldrake, but Rupert Sheldrake is a Harvard professor, right? And so he has impeccable legitimacy and credentials in the academic world. But he has unapologetically pursued research in all this. And he wrote many books and many academic papers laying out hard to dispute empirical evidence for what he was saying. And then he would talk to people like Richard Dawkins. And he would say, well, did you read my paper? And Richard Dawkins would say, like, no, I didn't read your paper. I wouldn't read that nonsense. It's like, but did you look at the data? It's like, no, I'm not going to look at the data, because, like, if it falls outside of this left brain framework, they're not interested. Not only are they not interested, they're terrified of it. They're terrified of it because it's going to show that they devoted their whole life to a very dressed down, very distorted version of truth.
Yeah, an incomplete model is what we say around our household. It's because the left hemisphere has to have its say, because that's what it does. But we also say that you can't stay there. Like, you can't stay in the model of the left hemisphere, because if you do, you're going to find yourself with a very incomplete look at the world, and then you're going to be demonstrating yourself incompletely, and then you're furthering the neuroplasticity of your mind into confabulation. And confabulation is the ability of the left hemisphere to quickly
exactly. And that's the shortcut to schizophrenia.
Yes.
And you don't even have to get all the way. Yeah, no, I'm not even joking. You don't even have to get all the way, because schizophrenia is considered a mental illness. But you can be mentally healthy but still have elements of schizophrenia in your mental setup, and it's very, very, it's scary, and I think it's tragic, because I think it deprives person of true joy in life. You can't really experience happiness and joy if you're stuck in that left hemisphere framework.
Well, it's interesting because going back to the beginning when you were describing, you started painting a picture about different things that you were researching. You went broader than just the local level. In order to start understanding the world around you, you went, okay, it's not enough just to look at what's going on around me. Then you started looking at, things like the vaccines, looking at finances. And so this idea of a broader framework, because the right hemisphere is all encompassing, this idea of a whole truth. To get nearer to a whole truth, you have to go beyond the parts. And so you can't just stay with your one bit. You have to gain more and more aspects. And that sounds like that's largely what you did. And you, even as a kid in your classroom, funny enough, you refused to confabulate that you knew what money is. That's why you kept asking the teacher, no, I still don't get it. I still don't get it. And so this questioning of your own axioms from the beginning, going, this is what people say they understand. Do I understand it? Is this really what I understand? And then you started asking those questions and continually expanded into bigger things and more complex entities that form the picture around you. So, and that it really is building neuroplasticity. And when we brought you on to talk about who the enemy is, now my family is a very strong proponent of the fact that first and foremost, you really should look at your own brain, because even though, as you alluded to in the beginning, there are these matrices and the system is, if you're going to dub an enemy, calling it a system is more important than calling it to individual people, because the system is a set of values and each hemisphere has their own set of values. And so to look at the system that we are fighting, you also started looking at what is a system that would be better. What system do I actually want to build if I don't want the system that's currently playing out around me? And so in tune, you were questioning the values of the system, and that in tune questions the people that are implementing the system, because then you have to look at their values. They are continually perpetuating the system. Why? And you have come to the conclusion, as my family also did with the brain, it's like, okay, so they are clearly engaging, whether it's both of their own volition, they might have their own natural proclivity from their family, their environments, but then also the drug-induced states that, you know, our pharmaceutical industry, and then even harsher drugs like LSD, in the case of the Manson family, for example. There are external as well as internal aspects that influence what your proclivity of hemisphere will be, and then in tune, what your values will be according to the system. So you've really gone to, it comes back home, and not even home as in your own country, which is where we went with Colonel Towner. She went, when you think of China, don't think of China, because again, that's still the system of borders that they gave you. She said, look at this province or state. Is it China, or is it Hong Kong, or is it Taiwan? Is it Canada, or is it Montreal, Ottawa? And those are very good ways to start. And then you are hitting it even home, or closer to home, going further into each person, because they can sell whatever system they want, but only you can buy into it. And so if we further look into ourselves and understand how we can get manipulated, we can look at every single individual, and that's regardless of the country, regardless of the religion, the ideology, and then you can pinpoint which hemisphere is probably perpetuating those values, because each hemisphere has their own values. So you've brought it not where I thought you would, but it is definitely what my family does purport to encourage people to understand. So you've definitely given us a big surprise out of what I thought we were going to go with this episode.
Well, I mean, my addition to that is just, I think that you're pointing out a lot of nuances that unfortunately it is this sort of left hemispheric, like, blanket statements, and that's the way it is. I think that you would probably know from reading the book yourself then as well, is that, like, the left hemisphere will gravitate towards things that are more public, and so it's less personal. And so when things are less personal, then you're not really looking for nuances, really, because you're just paying attention.
I think the left hemisphere is much more susceptible to propaganda.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to even, like, when we were talking about, like, for example, you were saying that, well, it wasn't China, it wasn't Russia, it wasn't Iran, it wasn't any of these factions that, you know, put forward the propaganda for like the vaccines was a prominent example that you kept using towards. And there are people that are like, well, no, like China is bringing in the fentanyl and the Wuhan lab, and what about this and what about that? And then they would actually they give their counter arguments that saying that's like, no, it did infiltrate us, like you, like it's in our government, it's got it's messing with our polling, so no, they did infiltrate our governments and blah, 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 and like all of that. And then when I'm kind of like looking at it, I would kind of be apt to think along the terms of that my family, and of course that's no surprise, but in the sense of, okay, well, what specifically about like China are we talking about? Like where? And also the thing that Colonel Tanner kept on emphasizing in the first episode that we're doing of this series was, again, that it's like, well, who, like, what historical evidence and precedence has been shown to show that there's any proof that this is even something that their culture gravitates towards? And then it goes a little bit further of going like, oh shoot, the British Empire has a propensity for doing this thing. Now, does that mean British people? No, it just means that there's a more encompassing gross entity. Then that's when you start getting to where we've been talking this whole time is, well, what ideas, what's going on in their brains, what happened in their childhood, their lives, like you look at the Huxley brothers, and like one of them killed themselves because there is something going on in their brain that was like, I can't handle what's happening. Like, you have to either drug me and like to induce my left hemisphere to this schizophrenic paranoid state where I feel the need to manipulate the people around me, or I will quite literally remove myself. Two of them were okay, and they were like, yeah, and not even, because again, they needed something external in order to transform their state of mind to be this way. And then the other one was like, no, I'm having none of it, and just boom. Like, and so there's like the nuances of the ideas of what's even festering inside of their minds, consequently our minds, that perpetuates the system that we get ourselves caught in, and then we start pointing fingers. And then at the end of the day, it's one of those, okay, so even if it was, are you going to be the one that goes and shoots this other person in the face that you know is actually just a soldier on the ground? Like, he's not probably the person that actually perpetuated the idea that this poor motherfucker and you have going on in your brain. But yeah.
Meet the household Luongo.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Two things which are seemingly unrelated but are, you know, ultimately related. So with regards to China, they're not the enemy, but they're not innocent either. And here's what I want to say about it. Yes, it's true. They've infiltrated everywhere. Academia, government, corporate structures, media, everywhere. But they're not doing that in order to take over Canada or the United States and turn you all into their slaves. The reason why they're doing this is because they have understood that their enemy is a system. And they understand that this system is enormously powerful because starting from 1840s, you know, like if we go back to 1830s, China was the world's premier civilization and the world's greatest economic superpower.
Yep.
And then came the British with their opium wars.
Lord Palmerston, yep.
Yeah, and destroyed them. They completely destroyed China. I mean, they brought it to its knees. They turned it in less than a century. You know, like a 6,000-year civilization. In less than a century, they took it from the number one economic superpower in the world to being the poorest country in the world. And the Chinese understood what happened. That is, they understood that this system can do that again. You know, because now they're doing it to the United States and probably to a good extent to Canada.
Not
you
probably.
know, all these this fentanyl. You don't get that without money laundering banks. Okay, first of all, money laundering banks. All of that converges on the City of London, and money laundering banks are the ringleaders of the drug gangs and the cartels. And the cartels like Sinaloa are like Fortune 500 companies. They have operations in 40 countries around the world. They're in every major city in North America, and they're practically untouchable. Okay, and they're so far in the game that if law enforcement is too close in pursuit to them, they will trigger like the human rights operations and create a human shield between law enforcement and the drug cartels. We go back to, let's say, 2016. In 2016, you had in 2012 you had the government of Obrador Lopez, who launched a war on cartels, and it was like a military war. That was like a real bloody military war. And they were starting to have results. And then, it was a bit problematic because a lot of people were getting killed. And then the new government that came in 2012. So Lopez Obrador, I think, finished his term in 2012. In 2012, Peña Nieto came into the presidency in Mexico. He continued the war, but with less military action, less violence. But ultimately, they went for this kingpin strategy. They tried to nab the cartel leaders, and so they busted in 2014. They busted the Sinaloa cartel leader, I forget, El Guapo, El Chapo. I forget which one. And he escaped, of course, because he was let go, most probably. And then they busted him again in 2016. And then the World Bank and the IMF started forcing structural adjustments on the Mexican government. And one of the things that they were demanding is a reform of education. And it's not like they said, like, we'd like you to reform education. They say, if you want loans from us, and every government needs loans from the IMF, especially third world countries, you need to implement all these reforms. And one of them was reform of the education, and it was done in such a way to make education like a profit institution, so that it could be privatized and bought and sold and have private owners and so forth. And so the teachers started revolting, and then you started to have increasing conflict between teachers and the state. And the teachers would it escalated to the point where they would picket around government buildings and camp and spend nights. And then they started doing barricades on the roads, blocking roads. And when you take a large group like that who starts to protest, then they introduce a violent element into these protests. And so that now you start having conflict between these violent elements and the police. But nobody knows that these are violent elements. Everybody knows that these are teachers. And then the Mexican police ended up killing like 10 or 11 of these people in one encounter. And then suddenly, like, the whole human rights industry went into an overdrive. And you started having these million-person protests in Mexico City, in all the cities in Mexico. Massive protests against government violence, and then it got picked up around the world, and people started having protests in front of Mexican embassies in a lot of Western cities. And, Amnesty International and blah, blah for human rights are everywhere around the world. Everybody piled on the government. But, you thought this was about human rights, but it was about defending the cartels. Why? Because these cartels generate something like, according to the U.S. Treasury estimates from 2017, $65 billion a year just from their operations in North America. Guess who launders that money and retains about 20% of it?
I'm gonna
People
say
like HSBC,
Yeah.
TD Bank, BMO, Citigroup, JP Morgan, well, you name it, all of the global systemically important banks. So if the government prevails over the cartels, Well, that's a hugely lucrative business that the banks lose. So the banks defend the cartels. They just can't advertise it to the rest of us. So they fund this whole human rights industries and anti racism industry and the LGBT industry and gay rights, and all of this serves ultimately to create these shadow armies that become activated when the government cracks down on crime. And this is exactly what happened December and January in the United States, when they started busting the organized crime, the Somali organized crime in Minnesota. And then all of a sudden, all these human rights people started coming out harassing ICE agents and border control agents. And they raised a huge havoc over the death of two people. And these two people deliberately confrontational with the federal agents. And now, of course, I have to give a token denunciation. Every life is a tragedy, but these organized crime gangs victimize literally tens of thousands of people every year. In Mexico, I think they kill dead close to 40,000 people a year. Everybody's heart breaks over Alex Preddy and this other person. Anyway, everybody knows about her and him and how wonderful they were and how extremely violent the police was that they killed him, and that this is an infringement on human rights and police violence and fascism and all of this. But nobody knows a single name of the tens of thousands of victims of organized crime, which is the reason why the federal agents intervened in the first place. So, that's that. Anyway, back to China. I think that China is infiltrating the whole system, not because they want to enslave us, but because they want to take it down. And you can see that because the Chinese are extremely sensitive about their century of humiliation. And Xi Jinping mentions it very often in his speeches. And they have worked out who or what inflicted the century of humiliation upon them. And they know that it's a system. They know that it won't help to go after Keir Starmer or what's this guy in Canada?
Mark Carney.
Yeah, Mark Carnage.
Mark Carney, right. It doesn't help. The whole system needs to be taken down. And I am almost certain that this is the reason why the Chinese have compromised I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, they're everywhere. They're in Hollywood, they're in the media, they're in the records, music industry, they're in the universities, in academia, they're in politics, and they have particularly infiltrated the Democratic Party, and they have corrupted many, many Democratic officials. You know what that means? They have the freaking receipts. They have the receipts, and when the time comes, these receipts are going to be used to take them down. And, the Chinese have a very long history of never colonizing any other nation and not spreading the empire beyond their borders. It happened on two occasions that they wanted to invade Japan, but that was both times when they were ruled by the Mongols. So Chinese have adopted the Confucian approach, the Confucian model. Their ambitions are to improve conditions of life in China and to uplift the rest of the world from poverty, because they want to sell them shit. It's easier to sell shit to people if they have money to spend. If they're dirt poor, then yeah, but
Yeah. And if they're not,
if they're
not dead, because dead people's bad for business, unless you're the oligarchs.
But they are, they don't have a history of slavery, and they don't have a history of colonialism. I mean, like zero, whereas we do. And they don't have history of going to war all the time, and we do, because you guys are Canadian, but like if we're talking about the United States has initiated 80% of all wars fought in the world between 1946 and today. More than 80% of all of them. So
One could argue
that
that's the British foreign policy at work too, right? I mean,
yes, yes, yes,
the
correct,
master
correct,
blaster type scenario where you got the little guy that's riding the big giant. And
absolutely.
one could argue that's actually how the Mongols played their role to China, because the Venetians used the Mongols
Yeah.
just like it's just so we got like some historical context that actually has continuity. Is the Venetians used the Mongols as their brute.
As their proxy, yes, yes, correct. Yeah, it's the same thing. So it's a system, and I think that the Chinese worked it out, and I think that this is what they're after. And I think that right now, I think they can count with the Russians as their partners in this, but they need the United, like you need the United States on your side to be able to take down this system. Anyway, so to shift to the other related but not related thing, because we talked about money, which is absolutely central to all of this. And money is is the domain of economics. And if you try to read economics textbooks to understand money, you're not going to get anywhere. And they're extremely boring and dry and hard to read. And people don't pick up a textbook in economics and then read it to figure out things. And so but I have done that, and I didn't get anywhere with it either, but I did, like, ultimately, I think just reading, pondering stuff, and trying to work it out for myself brought me to a point where I think I understood. And when I explain what I'm about to explain, I think it becomes so intuitively obvious that everybody will get it. All right, ready? Okay, so basically, picture this. You imagine a nomadic tribe. And if you were living in a nomadic tribe, basically everybody contributes to survival. Everybody works, from toddlers to the very oldest people. The only ones that don't work are babies and extremely frail or sick people. So basically, the whole population has to work to secure the tribe's survival and procreation. But now, once people figure out agriculture, they become much more productive and they start generating a surplus. And once they generate a surplus, now not everybody has to work anymore, because only a part of the population can secure sustenance and procreation for everybody else. And so now what you have is a surplus of labor. You have able bodies that can go do other stuff. And so, people living in some environment will have opinions about how they want to allocate that extra labor that they can afford now. And basically, they will want to build bridges, they will want to build roads, they might want to build cathedrals, libraries, temples, stuff like that. And so what has to happen is that people in a community decide, like, right, okay, I want to lead a squad of men, and we want to build a bridge across the river there, because on the other side there's fertile fields, there's further land that we could cultivate. Now the whole community has to keep these men and their families alive, right? The social surplus has to be allocated to these families to compensate the men who build a bridge for the work while they're working. A very obvious way to do it is to invent some kind of a token, because they'll say, like, okay, right, you need so much milk and so much cheese and so much meat and so much grain per day. And so they create some kind of a token to give to every family, to every workman, to say, like, here, this is for you to procure what you need while you're working on that bridge, since you're not going to be cultivating the land. Okay, so then they build the bridge, they use up their tokens, they exchange them for eggs and fish and grain and whatever. And then the bridge is built. And now, they can go across the bridge and they can start cultivating fertile lands across the river in the other valley. And when they start doing that, now they have even more surplus, right?
Force
Now they're even
multiplier.
more wealthy.
Yeah.
Now they have even more manpower. And then, they might decide to do the next thing. And so in this way, over years and decades and generations, a community becomes very wealthy. But you notice what these tokens represent when you allocate labor to something else other than just survival, is that these tokens represent social surplus, the social or real savings, right? They don't represent debt. There's no interest involved anywhere in the equation. And so the community goes wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. At some point, they might say, like, hey, I think building a pyramid would be a great idea. And they say, like, well, sounds good. Let's do that. So, people build pyramids and Chinese walls, and we build, thousands of magnificent cathedrals everywhere. Well, everywhere, I think maybe in Europe, but, then there's also temples of other kinds everywhere around the world. And over time, what you get is like an almost organic blossoming of civilizations, because at some point you're going to be so productive that if somebody says, like, hey, like, I want to do calligraphy, we will say, like, well, great idea, you go. And so you have an able-bodied man or woman who just sits at home and writes beautiful letters on pieces of paper. And then you'll get scientists who are going to be exploring stuff, and you're going to get architects, and you're going to get sculptors, and you're going to get people who write operas and symphonies and plays and films. And somebody will think up, hey, I think I know how to build a plane. We can do that. We can fly. But debt doesn't have to be anywhere in that equation. What happened is that the money system got hijacked by bankers. And so now they issue fraudulent money because it no longer represents the social surplus. The surplus productivity of the community. It represents debt. And then the bankers say, well, lending you money is risky, so I'm going to need to charge you interest. So now once you start paying interest, then what happens is that the wealth that the community generates starts to be sucked out to the banker. And so even though you have an extremely productive economy, you're no longer affluent. And then notice another element to this story is that the decisions about how to allocate this social surplus, the real savings, must be democratic, because people have to decide, do we want to build a bridge across the river? Do we want to build a cathedral? Or do we want to build a large matrix with CBDCs and create mRNA vaccines that everybody's going to be obliged to take? Because that takes a lot of investing. So if it's democratic, people will opt for beautiful spaces. They will opt for production of beautiful things rather than hyper production of crap. They will opt for funding libraries, scientific research, arts, science, technology that serves human life. Whereas if the decision of how to allocate capital is in the hands of the banker, well, then they will do what they want to do. And what they want to do basically is turn us into hackable animals, as they openly tell us. So that's where it is. It's that's what money represents. It not only does it represent, it must represent social surplus, the real savings of a community. And the decisions about how to allocate this social surplus must be democratic. It must be up to the community that actually lives where these investments are going to be made. And today that might be, people might say like, oh no, economies are too complex. You need the bankers as a mediator, blah 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 blah. Okay, yeah, maybe, but we have technologies today that would allow us to cut that middleman out, and the way that would be done is that, let's say, everybody gets a cut of this social surplus, right? Because there's so much, you can actually the conservatives, the conservatives might not like this, but there's a very valid argument to say that everybody should get a cut of the society's productivity. So like we're so wealthy and so affluent, we can give $1,000 a month to absolutely everybody, and then you give them a choice. You can have your $1,000 and you can spend it, or you can make an investment in it, of something. And now, it's hard to coordinate democratically with like 20 million people, but we can create a crowdfunding platforms where people who say like, oh, I want to build a bridge over the river, or I want to build a cathedral or a library, they can basically present their projects, and then people can buy shares in this project. I go and I see what's out there, and I say, I think a library would be wonderful. So, I have all this money coming in. I'll just pitch $1,000 into the building of a new library or into the building of a cathedral. That can be done. That can be done so beautifully and so seamlessly that it could become just another piece of social infrastructure that could feed the good blossoming of society, rather than building digital IDs and CBDCs and all this nonsense. So that can all be done.
It definitely goes to the two modes of attention that we bring up a lot in our household, right? Because what you've just described is probably the standard of the right hemisphere, because like all the things that you just mentioned have community driven, the quality of life expanding, not just one's individual self. There was a conversation, to go to the other side, the left hemisphere's perspective. There was a conversation, going to your anthropological theme that you had earlier, where tribes, when they were described the type of individual that Ian McGilchrist would describe in the like sort of schizophrenic or sociopathic, pathological liar, manipulator, which is really just a hyperactive left hemisphere approach and a mode of attention to the world. And when they would describe it, because like these tribes didn't have a word for sociopath, they didn't have a word for, but they recognized the pattern when you described what it was that these people would be doing within their community. And because this is an unavoidable dynamic of the human condition, you are going to run into people that have a propensity to gravitate, and we call it left hemisphere lock in our household, and they get locked on to a state of the world and how they view it. And so the gentleman that I was talking to said, yeah, that those people have hunting accidents. That's how they keep them out of their culture.
Exactly.
It's like when you recognize those individuals, you do your best to show any type of rehabilitation that you could possibly offer, because obviously condolences to every psychopath has a mother and a father. Yeah. So last thing anybody wants to see is a baby Thanos scenario being done to their kid. But when they recognize it in those cultures, they're like, this is what these people do, so sounds to me like in order for us to be able to try to sustain the attention of the right hemisphere within communities, and including the financial system that you just offered, there's probably some sociopaths that need to have some hunting accidents along the way.
You will always have them. That's inevitable. But in normal communities, and I grew up in one, the community has a way of dealing with them. So you can deal with them. They can be part of your life, but everybody knows to be on the lookout.
Right.
Oh, be careful about him.
Yes.
Like, don't let your kids stay with him. And you'll tell your kids, look, if this guy offers you candy, just like no, because he's weird. And then if they actually do something, then hunting accidents happen. Like just people will just beat the crap out of them. And then they will know that there's a price to pay.
Well, that's a
Whereas
very
in our societies, yeah.
you're right. People, you said people know to look out for them back in the day,
Yes,
and then those
exactly,
communities today.
exactly. And they know, and everybody knows who they are, you know.
Yeah.
But
Today we don't know how to look
people
out
don't
for
know.
'em.
They don't know the left hemisphere, and they don't know the systems, and so they don't know how to identify the enemy, which is really the system, which is an ideology, which is a hemisphere. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that it was so frustrating. I saw online even this woman that was saying, giving the most basic video on how to make sure you watch your child at a park when they need to use the washroom. And this plays because she was like, "Here's what I do. I say, oh, you need to go to the washroom. Okay, I open the door as the parent. I check inside." Okay, nothing's go ahead. I stand outside the door, like, and the reason she said that is because there was apparently an instance where there were like young children that were going into this bathroom, and then I think it was I'm not sure if it was her own child or someone else's, like, telling her this story, but they like went inside and there was a man waiting for these children to go into the washroom, and I think it was her daughter who was older at the time, right, going into the women's bathroom, and the man that was in there was angry that she wasn't a young child, so he didn't do anything, right? So she was free to go. But like, picture all of like the mother, she's like, okay, it's nice and all that you're like, okay, they're gonna go to the bathroom themselves, and because you could see them walk in and like they're safe. But the minute the door is closed and it's locked, you have no idea, and when they come out, you can't undo whatever it is that was done on the inside. And I think that that's one of the I was like listening to that, I'm like, that is so just so frustrating that that's even gotten to that point, that can be allowed to happen because you identify as a woman or whatever the fuck. I'm like, I just that's what is the tragedy that we're witnessing, is that it is in purposefully invoking us to actually become the psychopaths. Like, a lot of like probably the amount of people that are committing these crimes, and now we're okay with like, oh well, pedophiles are people too. It's like, yeah, they're people that should be shamed and ridiculed and maybe even hunting accidents. I'm like, and yet we're encouraging it, and it's just, that's what's so frustrating. But yeah, that was my
That's
my anecdote
the point
to
of
that.
this conversation, is to help people identify, again, whose battlefield are we on, because the reality is, for a lot of people nowadays, it's not yours. It's not the one that you set up. It is something that other people have been setting up, other systems, other battlefields that have been, the land has been toiled, and so you're just walking upon it, and now you are responding to somebody else's ideas, somebody else's intentions, somebody else's system, their values. And it is time that we start looking at that. And like Alex Krainer was saying, that takes more than just looking out one aspect. You can't just look at the pharmaceutical industry. You also have to look at the financial industry. You can't just look at one country, whether it is Iran, China. You have to look at all of them, because all of them have stakes in one another's games, because humanity, as also building off of Alex Krainer's point earlier, we're a lot more interconnected than we think. I mean, the fact that you can look at one another, and if you read The Master and His Emissary, you can look at another individual. You can start gaining their proclivities. If somebody starts to get angry about a certain topic, in your brain you can go, okay, they're a bit left hemisphere locked right now, which means you have to go out of your way to exercise extra right hemisphere consideration. Maybe now is not the time to have this debate with this person. Maybe you need to come at it from another way. Show them that you have more in common than they currently think. And so this whole podcast and what Alex Krainer has been getting at is how we can start identifying the left hemisphere when it is presented in front of us, and the left hemisphere system. And you will find it when you start looking, but it is a matter of moral attending to the world. You have to start looking for it. And hopefully this podcast and this series that we're doing will start equipping people with the right tools. These are the patterns that you can look for. These are the financial institutions that you should keep an eye out for.
Yeah, and my last little addition to that is, you also gotta, like, bringing it back to the nuances, and even when Alex, you were talking about the money and then what potential like systems could we start implementing, you were saying it might upset the conservatives to kind of talk a little bit about what if we had surplus and then we could actually decide that we wanted to give it forward, right, and pay it forward. I think that like I was also, this is one of the blessings and curses of actually like following some of the younger conservative demographic, is I get to listen to what some of their points are. And there was this example of basically like, why are you against like communism or socialism or whatever? And then it's a Republican girl going like, here's my rationale. And it was basically giving the example that it's like, if you're in school and you're working really hard to get your grades, and so you're like at 90% and you're doing really good, but it takes like hard work for you and all that, right? And then there's someone who's not really working that hard and they're kind of like, I don't know, at a B or whatever, or something less to you, right? And then someone was to say, in her example that she's painting, right? Someone was to say, how would you feel if someone was like, well, and what we're going to do is we're going to take part of your grade and just give it to them, so that way you're both like sitting at a B or something, like they were at D and you're now both at B or something like that, right? And they were like, that's not okay, because that person's not working as hard as I am. I'm working hard. And I actually thought about this metaphor, which I've heard conservatives use as well. And I don't think they're actually correlating it to their own arguments, which is the whole, you can, what is it? You can like fish for a man, but it's better to teach a man to fish, right? And I'm like, and they've used that before. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, well, you, this person who knows how to fish, you're the A student. You're the one that already knows how to do a thing, and it took you time and effort to figure it out, and you learned the thing. Maybe you were 7 and you were just lucky and you figured it out, and so now you can do the thing. And you come across someone who doesn't know how to fish, right? And by you taking the time, right, to teach them that, you're taking away from your own time to go fish, to go get yourself some fish. You're literally like, I'm going to take time out of my day to teach you how to fish. And so I'm taking my 90% or whatever, and I guess I'm so quote unquote reducing it by helping somebody else also figure it out for themselves. And so when they like, you use this analogy, and it means like this great thing of like, we need to help people to figure out how to do it for themselves. And then at the same time, you're like, well, I don't want to take away like my value just to like for somebody else just to have it degraded. And I'm like, this is the wishy-washiness that I think that we're facing is, well, hold on now. Like, I thought you say one thing and now you're saying another, and it's like, what's so wrong with trying to help people to become better, because that's what you've been advocating for. And then the next thing you do is you're like, well, I think it'll take away my value. And I'm like, but aren't you adding value? How does that take away from you?
Well, that's what Dad was saying, and that's what Alex, his story was the social surplus. And for context here in Alberta, that's really what even the Alberta Prosperity Project document on the value of freedom, the idea of even the resources, they brought up the idea of doing oil royalties to the people in times of surplus. Well, let's give it to the people. It is the Albertans' resources. And these are ideas that, like Alex was saying, they're not unheard of. It's not going to be the first time it's been done in history, but it is going to be a long time since we've been able to implement such things, because we've been under the left hemisphere system that we didn't acknowledge, didn't attend to. And so documents like this, movements like this, and then podcasts like this is how we can start implementing and finding the nuance. We can be more generous when we have more control over our values and our system. And so economically, that can apply in the case of Alberta's oil, but it can also apply in terms of our health. When you start taking down these constraints, then we are able to attend to one another better, because we will have a social surplus. But right now, we don't really have that. Or even if we do, people aren't paying attention to it. And that's what Dad said was so important about the 2 modes of attention, because right now there's a lot of possibility for Alberta, and it's going to take work. You know, like Alex's story said, you do need to work. That's why you will have that token to get the social surplus. But we absolutely, as Albertans, have a social surplus culture. We can absolutely acquire that if we don't already have it. It's just a matter of people taking the time to value it and look upon it. That way they can actually start getting there. Because with the mode of attention, in terms of like even banks, what Alex Krainer said, like, who it doesn't, a bank is fine if it's run by the local people. It's under your system and it's run by, the Joe Blow neighbor that you have right here, who it isn't a third party from another country that doesn't have a care about how the community doesn't want to input. No, it's managed by your person here, your community. And then that way, if something goes wrong, accountability, as Alex also alluded to, can be held. So it's not like banks are inherently evil when you have a system and a moral society that are aiming to help one another and contribute to the social surplus. So these are all things that we, as Alex said in the very beginning, this, or Macy likes to allude to, it's the best thought experiment about how can we implement a better system? How can a good country be formatted, a good rule of law that people can trust, and so they can start building? And this is the goal for each Albertan, to start thinking about that system, how they can contribute to it, because it is acquirable, but only if you attend to it. And so that's the moral of the story for this whole segment and this series. Dad, do you have any last thoughts before I give it to Krainer to do?
No, we've kept his time. We're further than I anticipated. So I just want to say thank you very much. Where can people reach you and follow you? And hopefully this will open up for future conversations with you, because we're very honored to have you. And we know that you're a high commodity and you're sought after. We're looking forward to seeing you, because we know that you're coming to Alberta and Calgary for the Sean Newman Cornerstone event, of which we will also be attending as plebs to learn and listen to all of these minds. So if there's anything that you would like to add, then let people know how to follow you and be a part of your life.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. It was a great pleasure to join you today. I think I would just add that one thing that I've observed with the people who call themselves conservative in general, and usually it has to do with economics, is that they're very, very scrupulous that nobody should get what they don't deserve. And so these stories about, if you equalized everybody's grade in the class, then you're rewarding the laggards and the slackers and punishing those who work hard. Those stories seem to make sense at first blush, but that's not how societies work. Basically, if you give money to the undeserving just because they're part of your community, you say like, okay, we can perfectly afford to give everybody $1,000 a month. That means that everybody's going to have $1,000, and those who work hard are going to have more. Okay, so even the last slacker will have $1,000 to spend every month. And then if you work on something, you create something, then you get $2,000 or $3,000 or $5,000 a month. The advantage of this system is that even if you're like the last of the cold-hearted conservatives who wouldn't give a penny to the undeserving, isn't it better that the lazy bums and slackers have money to spend? Because if you own a business, you want to have clients. You don't have a business without clients. And if people are completely broke, who are you going to sell to? So like if you opened a restaurant and everybody in your community is broke, you're not going to have a good restaurant, right? It's not going to work. But if everybody has $1,000 to spend per month and they can bring out their families for dinner once a week, then your restaurant is going to be full of people and they're going to be happy. Otherwise, you're going to have homeless people and your children might have to go to school and walking past homeless encampments. What's better? And then, the way our money system works, there is no chance, like it's mathematically impossible for there not to be money given to undeserving and slackers. The only thing is that as things stand, that money goes to the, big ag and big pharma and big oil and big, you name it. It goes to big corporations. They get hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies every year. And these subsidies are exactly this. But if you give subsidies to ordinary people, they're going to spend it on ordinary things, meaning they'll spend it on shoes and t-shirts and dinners and sports clubs and whatever, ordinary things. So they will be supporting ordinary businesses, and they will be making ordinary people in community affluent with their ordinary activities.
So
If you give,
implies because people can change. And so you make, because the reality
yeah,
is we can all be
exactly.
those slackers and bums at times, but
Yeah,
that doesn't
yeah.
mean you have to stay there.
Exactly. Somebody who maybe look like a slacker and a bum today, maybe just didn't get lit up on some idea yet. At some point they might, the circumstances in their life change. They get a sense of purpose, and they might create something. And somebody who used to be a very successful person might have a failure. So I think that it's best to keep everybody at a certain minimum level of prosperity for the whole society to be healthy and functioning.
I feel so bad we're going for so long, but I like the approach though that you're trying to come at, and it's something that's worth considering. Is the idea of like, I agree that I wouldn't want necessarily the person who's quote unquote a bum now, right? But that doesn't mean they can't, come up with a great idea. I wouldn't want them going and putting it towards like big pharma, right? That's actually essentially just meant to kill you, right? And I think like I wouldn't want them going and putting it towards any sort of like drug or addictions or anything like that, right? Because I'm like, that's not going to improve your quality of health either. And I would look at it then, and I think that this has kind of been the thing for even the like tying it into the independence movement as well, is like our equalization payments were technically our version of our surplus, because we are the most like prosperous next to BC and Saskatchewan as well when it comes to our what we can produce. And so you could say it's our surplus, right? And so we were giving it out to the provinces, particularly the eastern provinces, and what it is that they choose to do with it, I mean, that's kind of like, that's going to be what it is that they choose to do with it, right? But in terms of our decision on wanting to become independent, now we have a bit more of a say of what do we want to do with our surplus, right? And how do we get more of it so that way we can potentially uplift the quality of life of those quote unquote bums? Because if like, of course, I don't want them to put it towards like all of the things that I just previously listed, right? But if someone has that ability, perhaps to kind of go like, shoot, like I was in a hard time, I was in a bad place, and I got a little bit of some help, right? That you don't know where that could take them mentally of, I want to pay that forward, I'm going to work harder, or I'm going to figure out a way to invest further back because I got invested into, right? Sometimes there are those people, and sometimes there's those people where, like in this hypothetical, this like I got $1,000 and I got to take my family out to dinner and we had a good time and it uplifted the spirits and everybody's kind of feeling really like happy about that. And then it might like get them to see, oh, well, I guess we'll just rely on the next one that we get. But they're like, no, I want to have more opportunities with my family. I want to do more stuff with them. I want to give that to someone else. Like I want them to be able to have this experience, right? And I think that that's where it's interesting to see this nuance play out of where can that go? Because the thing with Alberta that was stifling us is we were expected to be grateful of the interest payments, which was technically just capping our oil and all this stupid bureaucracy with the climate agendas. It's like we were paying interest when we were the ones that were fucking giving out the loan. We were like, what the hell? We're paying interest on our own.
That's funny.
Like that makes no sense. And that's I think that's where we're like, no, thank you. I would like to be the one that can just make it, and I don't have random ass interest and random ass caps on what it is that we can and cannot do and try and prosper as a society. That just like for this arbitrary agenda, and then yet you demand more of me, and then you're like, you should be grateful that we're exploiting you, and I'm like, what the fuck? What is that? What the hell? Sorry.
Yeah. With regards to the $1,000, payments to people, the caricature of a person is that they would just be lazy and inert and just rely on that. But we all have deeply hardwired need to create. So even if somebody was, sitting back in their house reading books for 2 years, at some point, maybe they'll read something that'll give them a different idea, and then they're gonna, try, or they're gonna fall in love with somebody and they're gonna do something together with their partner, or, people's circumstances in life change. So that caricature is just completely needless. And then even if you do have some people who will be exactly like that, who will be just like dependent and inert for the rest of their lives, it's going to be so few in a society, so few, that it's going to be completely negligible as a cost to society. And in the meantime, they're still going to be spending that money to the benefit of local businesses. So
Yeah, and I think the thing that you're pointing out is it starts with you, as in if you're not thinking about these ideas, even these little thought experiments that we're doing, it's like how many people are really thinking of a thought experiment like just your simple $1,000. If you had to like give it out to someone, what would that look like? And then they're not thinking about how do you cultivate a culture that does want to create? I mean, yes, we do. We have it instinctively in us, but I'm like, how do you nourish that so that we can actually get off the ground? And I think that's what we're trying to figure out how to do with this conversation.
Unfortunately, most people will, they'll read Murray Rothbard and Friedrich from Hayek, and as soon as you open your mouth, they're gonna slap you with the label you're a communist or you're a socialist, and they're not gonna hear your second thought. And that's a little bit like Richard Dawkins with Rupert Sheldrake. They'll just refuse to entertain anything you have to say. But I think that open-minded discussion, debate, walkthroughs through all these issues and problems, it's just like, okay, what happens if we do this? And then what happens next? And I think you'll get better insights and better ideas, and you can resolve them intuitively. You don't have to rely on economic textbooks. I think you'll get to better solutions than if you decide, oh, I'm an Austrian, I just go with Austrian economics and that's it. And so if it's not Austrian economics, then you're a loser, and I don't want to hear the next thing.
Or it's London economics, in which both of these economic systems were brought to you by the British Empire.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, then
exactly.
I think lastly, like I'm so sorry. Maddie's looking at me like, bruh, we need to end this. But my last 2 cents was I started reading Lyndon LaRouche's So You Want to Learn Economics, and I think one of the things that doesn't actually get defined is what is your definition of economic success? Like, what does it look like?
Who are you people?
No.
Who are you people? You're reading Ian McGilchrist and Lyndon LaRouche? Hello?
But yeah.
What else are we supposed to do?
What else are we reading? Well, we're reading this.
Oh my God!
We're reading this. We do a lot of reading.
Cynthia. Yeah, okay. You guys are definitely far-right extremists. I can see that.
We're just talking about being charitable and then giving handouts. What do you mean we're far right?
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Well, if you want to learn more about economics, I'm kidding.
Nice. There we go.
Alex Krainer, as if you guys haven't garnered by now, he's not just he's a trend follower, so you can learn economic systems from him, but he's also clearly a geopolitical analyst. Yeah, I was gonna say Meister.
Nice.
So you can find him as Alex Krainer on Substack, and then you can get his Alex Krainer Substack, The Trend Compass, where you can follow some of the more financial markets. And then I don't know why he's Naked Hedgie on X.
That can be for another time, because we definitely are going to want to have you on affording that you're actually okay with that. But
yeah, if you're willing to hang out with these white supremacists that you're talking about.
No, you guys remember The Naked Chef, Jamie Oliver?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a British thing. You have one of those cooking programs. And Jamie Oliver became extremely popular, and his thing was called The Naked Chef, and naked meaning not holding back anything, I show you everything how it is. And so I thought that's kind of cool. So I thought naked hedgy.
Because you're a hedge
I
fund,
like it.
because hedge fund management, right?
Ah,
I
If
like
you
it.
invite me to participate in one of these things naked, I'm afraid I wouldn't want to do that.
so
You know,
follow,
these videos live forever on the internet.
yes, follow this naked hedgie on X, or he's got a YouTube channel of which you can get further in depth into his mind, because I promise you, you've had a small taste, and it's a taste that even, you know, as followers of Alex Krainer, I can, if unless you guys say otherwise, but I was pleasantly surprised over some of the content that
Oh yeah,
he brought up
I
today, and
I
that's
was drinking that up, all
right.
of it.
Yes, he brought. This is the nice thing. How you know he's intelligent. Back to the beginning, I said the point of the series is changing axioms, and this is a man who constantly updates his systems, which you have to do in a financial market, but he does this with every market, and then even the way he analyzed his kids. So changing axioms, he brought in new things that we didn't know he paid attention to, because he's still garnering knowledge. And now that is your job. So mirror this lovely individual.
So
Alex
that way you
Krainer.
can learn to spell
Yes.
Like a horse.
like a horse.
Yes.
You said imitate. I was just playing off of it.
Sure. Without further ado, everybody, this has been
Politics at Home with Holmes.
yeah. Thank you, everybody. Toodaloo.
Bye.